Chapter 8. In an instant, Georgie and his dad were halfway across the room. What happened? Georgie's father cried. Are you okay, Mom? Georgie asked. Georgie's mother rubbed her arm. I'm fine, she said. I just got a little electrical shock, that's all. Did it hurt? Georgie asked. She shook her head. Not too bad, but she looked worried. She squeezed her husband's shoulder. Alan, she asked him, do you think the baby? She nodded. The thing about babies who weren't born yet, Georgie realized as his parents discussed and worried, was that he couldn't ask them how they were feeling or if they'd received an electrical shock. That's why Georgie's mom and dad decided they'd better go to the hospital and check things out just to be sure. Georgie shouldn't have to spend Christmas Eve in a hospital waiting room, his mom said. Let's call the Morettis and see if he can stay with them for a few hours. And just like that, it was decided. Georgie was dropped off at Andy's house, and his parents streaked off in the car to check the health of their precious little baby Godzilla. Nona Rosa greeted Georgie at the door. Georgino, she cried out, arms spread open to welcome him. She stooped down to grab his shoulders and peck him quickly on both cheeks. Georgie gave a forced smile as she babbled at him in Italian, and he resisted the urge to wipe the grandma kisses off his face. Georgie, Andy's mom called as she raced toward him. Happy Christmas. How is your mother? I think she's okay, Georgie said. They're just checking baby He stopped himself in time. I mean, the baby. Mrs. Moretti gave him a reassuring smile. I'm sure it will be fine, she said. Andy poked his head out of his bedroom door. Hey, Georgie, he cried. Come help me with something. Georgie couldn't believe how different Andy's room looked from the day before. The bed had been moved closer to the door and was covered by a fraying gray quilt. The dresser was piled with antique-looking bottles, and all of Andy's frantic fusion posters had been crammed together in one corner above the roll-away bed and now stood against the far wall. Wow, Georgie said quietly. Andy was standing on the roll-away, holding up a blue sheet with fluffy white clouds stamped on it. I know, huh? We might be moving soon, but until then, he lifted the sheet as high as he could, apparently reaching for the ceiling, but he was still a good foot away. Does she snore? Georgie asked. Nah. Andy began to pile all his pillows into one stack in the middle of the bed, but she does get mad when the room is messy. And she's always trying to get me to speak Italian. He climbed on the pile of pillows and lifted the sheet to the ceiling again. But just as his hand touched the ceiling, the pillows slipped out from under him and he toppled to the bed. You want to help me here? He asked Georgie. What do you want me to do? Georgie asked as he neared the bed. I don't know. Maybe hold the pillows so they don't keep moving? Okay. Georgie held down the mound of pillows while Andy climbed on top again. What are you doing anyway? I'm creating a barrier. What? I need some privacy, you know. Andy held the sheet to the ceiling with his left hand and fumbled in his pocket with his right, all the time wobbling on the pile of pillows. Georgie attempted to steady him by grasping his leg. At least Andy pulled out a push pin and stuck the sheet into the ceiling. Then he jumped down and began moving the pillow pile over a few feet. When they had finished, the blue sheet was hung crookedly around half of Andy's rollaway bed, but it was just wide enough to hide everything. Georgie and Andy sat at the bed, their backs against the wall, the tips of Andy's shoes flicking at the sheet canopy, and stared gloomily at the grandma side of the room that still lay exposed. Got any other sheets we could use? Georgie asked. Nope, Andy said with a sigh. They're all on her bed. Maybe some towels? Don't think that they'd be long enough, Andy sighed. I wish I still had my own room. Russ thought maybe I could move to the attic, but my mom didn't go for it. Georgie squinted one eye. Russ? His voice sounded squeaky. He tried to make it more normal. When did you see Russ? Oh, I just talked to him on the phone, Andy said. He kept kicking at the sheets, acting like talking to Russ Wilkins on the phone was the most normal thing in the world, like he did it every day. His parents wanted to know what time our church service was tonight. Russ goes to your church? Georgie asked. Why hadn't Andy ever told him that before? Yeah, anyway, I thought it was a good idea about the attic, but Mom has said there's no insulation or something. Andy shrugged. Oh, yeah, and Russ said he can start helping with the dog walking next week. He even found us 2 new clients. What? Georgie cried, accidentally banging his head against the wall. He turned to face Andy. Why did you tell him he could help us? I thought we decided no. Andy didn't meet Georgie's gaze. He just kept kicking the sheet. No, you decided no. Andy was talking so quietly, Georgie could barely hear him. Georgie didn't think he'd ever heard Andy talk like that before. Well, that's because I don't think it's a good idea, Georgie said. How are we supposed to make more money if we have to split it between 3 people instead of 2? Now Andy turned to Georgie. His eyes were wide and he looked excited. Because we can advertise, he said. That was Russ's idea. If we do that, we can get tons more dogs. Me and Russ can walk all the big ones, and you can walk all the little ones. Me and Russ. Georgie didn't like the sound of that. He didn't like the idea of Andy and Russ on the phone talking about all the things that they could do together, saying that Georgie couldn't walk any of the big dogs because he was so small he might get trampled. I don't know, Georgie said. Oh, come on, Andy replied. I already told him he could, and I don't want to be mean because he's really cool. You'd like him a lot. Georgie thought about it. He had to admit, Russ didn't seem like the type of kid who would make fun of him. Maybe Andy was right. Maybe it was a good idea, and it couldn't hurt to make more money. All right, Georgie said at last. There was a knock on Andy's door, and Mrs. Moretti poked her head inside. Boys, can you? She stopped. Andrea Moretti, she said. Is this what you wanted for my sheet for? Andy peered his head out from hiding. Georgie decided he'd rather stay out of view. Uh-huh, Andy said. Mom, I need some privacy, she sighed. Did you put holes in it? Not big ones. There was a pause, another sigh, and then Vabin. Georgie wasn't completely sure what that meant, but from the way Andy's mom said it, he could tell she was giving in. Come help set the table, she said. Georgie, too. For the next hour or so, the Morettis kept Georgie pretty busy. He directed traffic in the living room, while Andy and his father moved the sofa, and Mrs. Moretti and Nona Rosa set up the folding table. He stood on a chair in front of the stove to stir pots. He folded bright red napkins and set them on the table and climbed up the rickety ladder to the attic to help Andy search for candles. But as busy as he was, Georgie couldn't help thinking about the way Christmas Eve should be. If this were a normal Christmas Eve, Georgie realized as he looked at the clock on the wall, he and his parents would just be coming back from church. Then they'd sit down at the kitchen table with a regular paper, napkins, and roast beef sandwiches because they'd be saving all the really difficult cooking for Christmas Day. After dinner, Georgie would be allowed to open just one present before he went to bed. He'd pick out the perfect one, too, a flat square package he was sure was the How to Build Homemade Rockets manual he'd been begging for forever. He couldn't wait to get home and spend Christmas Eve the right way. Every time he heard a car drive past the house, Georgie was sure it was his parents, ready to take him back home before the night was over. But it never was. It was just past 8 o'clock when the phone rang. Georgie held his breath as Mr. Moretti answered it. Could it be? Georgie couldn't figure out much from Mr. Moretti's side of the conversation. He just kept saying, of course it's not a problem, over and over. Finally, he held out the phone to Georgie. It's your father, he said. Georgie grabbed the phone. Hi, Dad. When are you coming to get me? Hey, kiddo, look, he sighed. We're going to be here a while. Everything's fine, but you have no idea how many accidents there are on Christmas Eve. There's this one guy who had a little mishap with a turkey. Anyway, it might take a long time. I asked Andy's dad, and he said you could spend the night with them if we can't get out of here at a decent hour. Is that okay? I guess so, Georgie said. Sorry, Georgie. We'll see you soon, okay? Okay. Merry Christmas, G. Yeah. As Georgie ate his way through all the courses of the Moretti Christmas dinner, pasta, venison, potatoes, salad, he couldn't help thinking that right about now he'd be snuggled up on the couch listening to his parents playing his favorite Christmas songs just for him. His mom would be sitting at her harp, hair swept on top of her head, strumming out a melody with her long, graceful fingers. And his dad would be sitting right beside her at his cello, his bow bouncing out of steady rhythm against the strings, back and forth, back and forth. And Georgie, his toes curled between the cushions of the couch and a blanket pulled up to his chin, would doze slowly off to sleep, not to waken until Christmas morning. They had just finished dinner when Mrs. Moretti informed them that they should start getting ready for church. Church? Georgie asked, trying to stay calm. But it's already 9 o'clock. Mass is at 10, Mr. Moretti informed him. Georgie turned to Andy and gave him a look of horror, but Andy just shrugged. It's not so bad, Andy told him as they put their dishes in the sink. It's only an hour. Then we get to sleep in late. Sleep in? That wasn't how it worked. Georgie was supposed to be at his house, already asleep on the couch so he could wake up super early, race into his parents' bedroom, and open presents with them while the sun came up and they sipped their coffee. There was no sleeping in on Christmas morning, and who in their right mind would go to church at 10 o'clock at night? Georgie couldn't believe this. The entire way to the church, Georgie sat squished between Nona Ross and Andy, with his arms folded angrily across his chest. He frowned as they walked through the door, and all the people who didn't know him smiled like he was just the cutest little thing ever. One old man even patted him on the head and asked him how old he was. And then Georgie caught sight of Russ. Russ and his white blonde hair you couldn't help noticing from a mile away. He waved at them and ran over. Hey, Andy, he cried. Hi, Georgie. I didn't know you went to this church. I'm just visiting, Georgie mumbled. Georgie shuffled his feet as Andy's parents chatted with Russ's parents, who were both about 1 billion feet tall. They all filled into the pews and sat down. Georgie next to Andy, next to Russ, and all the parents behind them. Russ leaned over Andy to talk to Georgie. I have some really great ideas about how to advertise for a dog walking business, he said. Our business, Georgie thought. Hadn't it all been his idea? But he didn't say anything. As the choir began to sing, Georgie noticed something. There were no candles. What kind of a church would forget to hand out candles? The one time out of the whole year that church was actually cool and there were no candles. And Russ was here. The only thing worse would be if Jeannie the Meanie were sitting behind him. Tap, tap, tapping on his back during the whole service. Georgie hated his church, he decided, this church without candles. He was so angry he refused to sing any of the songs, even the ones he liked. Of course, it didn't help that Nona Rosa was standing right behind him, singing all the hymns in Italian at the top of her lungs. And he kept getting confused during the whole service. Everyone else seemed to know when to kneel and when to stand and when to start singing, and Georgie kept stumbling along behind. There were Russ and Andy doing everything together perfectly, and there was Georgie looking like a moron. He was sure everybody was staring at him, thinking he obviously didn't belong. About halfway through the service, Georgie stopped trying. He sat on the wooden pew, his arms folded across his chest. He didn't sing, he didn't follow along with the Bible passages. He just stared at his feet, his tiny little feet in his Velcro-strapped shoes. Andy and Russ both had lace-ups. Favor time. You have to be wearing shoes for this one. Shoes with laces. So go out, put some on if you need to. All right, are you ready? Untie both your shoes. You can put the book down while you do it. I'll wait for you. Done. Good. Now I want you to hold your hands out in front of you and curl your fingers so you can't see past your knuckles. Then, with your fingers still curled up tight like that, I want you to tie your shoes. I'm serious. Tie your shoes. Give up yet? Well, I did. I tried to do it for about 15 minutes. It's really hard. Anyway, that's why Georgie's shoes are Velcro. Just thought you should know. You can straighten out your fingers now. When they got back to the Morettis, there was a message on the machine from Georgie's father that said that they were still at the hospital. So Georgie would have to spend the night, which meant he wouldn't be getting his rocket book until late tomorrow morning, and he wouldn't be able to leap into his parents' bed and wake them before the sun came up. It was his last Christmas without baby Godzilla around, and it was ruined, completely ruined. Things would never be the right way again. And Andy lent Georgie a pair of pajama pants, the smallest pair he owned. They were way too big, and Mr. Moretti gave him the tie from his bathrobe to keep them up. Georgie stood at the sink in Andy's bathroom on the step stool that the Morettis had bought years ago just for him, and brushed his teeth next to Andy. Andy had a toothbrush. Georgie had to use his finger. Should we sleep in my room or in the living room? Andy asked between spits. Living room, Georgie said. Usually they slept in Andy's room. They'd trade off turns for the bed, and whoever had to sleep on the floor got the comfiest pillow. But Andy's room felt like a grandma room now, and Georgie didn't think that he'd ever get used to that. Okay, Andy said, rinsing off his toothbrush. I'll get the sleeping bags. As Georgie and Andy nestled into their sleeping bags in the living room, with the pine scent of the Christmas tree looming over them, Georgie couldn't help noticing that the feet lump in his sleeping bag was much higher up than Andy's. He wondered if Andy ever noticed stuff like that. "So, what do you think about those flyers?" Andy asked. Georgie mashed his pillow into a comfortable ball and turned to look at Andy. "Huh?" he said. "Those flyers Russ was talking about. You know, advertising for a business. Don't you think Russ should do that? Draw dogs on it and everything? He's a good drawer." "It's my business," Georgie said. He hadn't planned on saying it, it just kind of came out. But as soon as he said it, he was glad he had, because it was true. "What?" Andy asked. "It's my business," Georgie said again. "I thought of it, so I should be in charge of advertising, and I don't think we should have advertising." "But Russ says, and Russ can't be in it either. I decided." Andy sat up in his sleeping bag. It was dark, so Georgie couldn't see his face. He was kind of glad about that. "That's not fair," Andy told him. "Too bad," Georgie said. He rolled over and faced away from Andy toward the tree. "It's my business." Andy was silent for a long time, and Georgie didn't know what to think. He was starting to wish he hadn't said anything. "Well, maybe I'll start my own business then," Andy said at last. "Fine," Georgie said. "Fine," Andy replied. "And Russ will be in it with me, and we'll walk 4,000 dogs, and we'll leave all the poodles for you." Georgie could feel his face burning. Andy had never said anything like that to him before. Never. Georgie curled the edge of the sleeping bag up to his chin and stared at the Christmas tree as he spoke. "Maybe your grandma can help you too," he said. "Your smelly old grandma who stinks up your whole room." Behind him, Georgie could hear Andy thrashing around in his sleeping bag for a few seconds before it was completely quiet again. It was quiet for a long, long time. Georgie waited for Andy to say something, but he didn't. And when Georgie turned around to see if he'd fallen asleep, Andy wasn't there. His sleeping bag was empty. He must have gone to sleep in his room, his grandma's room, and left Georgie all alone on the living room floor on Christmas Eve.